What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, I'm going to share the 3 rules of winter swim bait fishing. Let's get into it. Rule number 1 of wintertime swim bait fishing is skip the suspended bass. In other times of the year, a swim bait is a great tool at targeting bass that are suspended in the middle of the water column, basically between the surface of the water and the bottom of the lake. And while there are a lot of suspended bass in the winter, I find that a swim bait is not the most effective tool for targeting those fish. Instead, you can catch them a lot easier on baits like a jerkbait or a jig head minnow. The swim bait, though, is really good at a different application, and that's drawing fish out of cover that are close to the bottom of the lake. One big misconception I think anglers have about winter fishing is that the best fishing you're going to have is targeting fish that are suspended, because there's so much hype around the jerkbaits and the Alabama rigs in the wintertime. But I've found over the years that I can catch a lot more numbers as well as some really big fish by targeting the actual bottom of the lake, especially areas that have bigger rocks, boulders, or some type of object in the water that's going to hold heat close to the bottom. And a swim bait is the perfect tool for targeting these fish that are setting up around rocky bottoms and just the bottom in general, because you can vary the retrieve of this bait, fishing it as deep as you want and bounce it over the bottom. It's harder to do that with a bait like a crankbait or a jerkbait, which are other typical winter baits, because you're capped at how deep those baits can go based on the diving depth of that bait. But with a swim bait, you can work it down a lot deeper. Now, if you can weight a jerkbait down in those situations, a lot of times you can catch some really good fish and sometimes even more fish. But in general, a swim bait is just a little bit more versatile and well-rounded in that situation. So it's my go-to bait when the fish are on the bottom. The trick with this, though, is that you want to make sure you are getting that bait down to the bottom. And that's one of the biggest issues I see anglers having when they're fishing swim baits in the winter. Even though they think they're making bottom contact with their bait, they're not. And that leads us into rule number 2. Rule number 2 of winter swim bait fishing is maintain bottom contact with your swim bait. This may seem a little bit counterintuitive because, again, you think about fishing swim baits most of the time in the middle of the water column. But I get the majority of my bites in the wintertime on a swim bait when it's actually making contact with the bottom of the lake. It doesn't need to be digging into the rocks or dragging across the bottom like a Carolina rig or a jig. You just want to make sure that it's making bottom contact every so often when you're working it in. And I actually find that it's better if you're not grinding it in the rocks or in the bottom, but you also don't want that bait sitting 10-15 feet away from those rocks and off the bottom, because those fish are less likely to chase in the winter time. A lot of times those fish are going to be more lethargic, and they may only want to come a maximum of 5 feet off the bottom to come eat this bait, rather than 10 or 15 feet off the bottom like they might in the summertime and warmer months of the year. There's a lot of different ways you can ensure that your swim bait is staying in that depth zone. The first is actually making sure you can feel your swim bait hitting the bottom of the lake. So when you're retrieving that bait, you want to feel it bump something every, let's say, 5 to 10 seconds. Again, it's not this constant grinding into the rocks, but as you reel it, you want to reel to the point where you're feeling it bump something every 5 to 10 seconds. This also means you probably need to be reeling your swim bait a lot slower than you think you should be. This is a major mistake I see anglers make in the wintertime with the swim bait, is they reel it way too fast. In general, my average retrieve speed with a swim bait is 1 rotation of the reel handle every 1 to 2 seconds. A lot of times it's every 2 seconds. So 1,000, 2, 1,000. So I'm literally rotating that reel 1 full rotation every 2 seconds. It seems unbelievably slow, but what's actually happening is that your bait is going to be penduluming back to the boat after it lands in the water. So there's going to be just a kind of normal forward motion to the bait, even if you don't reel the bait at all. So by reeling the bait just a tiny bit, basically just picking up your slack, that will get that bait to swim forward and move along so that it's staying close to the bottom. If you ever watch a swim bait on forward-facing sonar, as soon as you start reeling that reel handle, let's say 1 crank per second or maybe 2 cranks per second, you'll see that swim bait immediately rises straight up to the surface and is going to get away from the bottom, and it's going to get away from those fish. So an extremely slow retrieve is critical. You also want to be throwing a slower gear ratio reel if you can get away with it. The fastest I'll ever throw with a swimbait is a 6:3:1 gear ratio reel. Though if I can go down to a 5:1 gear ratio reel, that's even better in the winter time. In the summer, I might throw a 7:1 gear ratio reel because I'm trying to fish it faster, but in the winter, you want that slow gear ratio. You also want to throw lighter line. Lighter line will let you get that bait down deeper. So on a bait caster like this, I'm gonna be throwing 10-pound fluorocarbon line and even 8-pound at times. And then when I'm throwing it on a spinning rod, I'll be going down to 6-pound fluorocarbon leader with 10-pound braided line for my main line. So very thin line. You also want to make sure you're throwing the right swim baits. You don't want a swim bait that's too heavy to the point where it's going to sink really fast and you have to reel it at a faster speed to avoid it from digging in the rocks, but you don't want a swim bait that's too light because then you won't be able to get enough action out of it. And you also want to make sure you have a hook that promotes a good action in your bait and a swim bait that promotes a good action on a slow retrieve. There's some swim baits where you work them and literally at that slow of a retrieve, they have no action at all. And that's not a good thing at all because basically that bait's just going to come back to the boat with no tail wiggle. There are a lot of different good swim baits and jig head combinations that I've tried over the years, but recently we came out with a new hook from Core Tackle just a couple years ago, which is the Ultimate Swim Bait Hook, or tush. We have two versions. We have the regular tush, which has a stouter hook in it that's better for bait casting equipment, and then the finesse tush. The finesse tush has a lighter wire hook designed for spinning rods. In both cases, my preferred size is the 2/0 1/4 ounce for wintertime swim bait fishing. We have the 2/0 1/4 ounce in the regular tush and in the finesse tush. The finesse tush has a smaller hook to it, but both a 1/4 ounce. The great thing about this hook is it hides all of the weight inside of your soft plastic swim bait, and that's going to give this bait more body roll at slow speeds. You're not just going to get tail kick, you're actually going to get body rotation as well as tail kick, and this just promotes more action out of the bait. Because that lead is also internally weighted in that swim bait, it's going to come through and over rocks a lot better when you're trying to get it down there in the bottom. And that's why a lot of anglers over the years have gravitated to bigger swim baits. They're internally weighted, like the Huddleston swim bait. This is actually like a mini version of the Huddleston swim bait that I'm throwing with this 2/0 1/4 ounce regular tush. And this is the OSP HP fish. I love this little bait. It's literally a mini Huddleston. It has that Huddleston style tail. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's not really a paddle tail. It's more of like a wedge tail to it. And it has an amazing action to it. The issue with these swim baits is that they're very expensive. They're literally like $3 a swim bait. This pack is like 14 bucks. It's ridiculously expensive, honestly. And that's why I throw it on that tush hook as well, because that tush hook will hold the bait on better and you can catch 5 to 8 fish per bait compared to a regular jig head, which might only get you 1 to 2 fish. Basically, this hook or this bait is very soft, but with that tush hook in it, it will stay together better and you get more fish catches. You can also use some like Mend It and other types of soft plastic repair glue and things like that to kind of mend up that bait if it gets torn up a little bit, but it's definitely worth it. It catches a ton of fish and it works extremely well on that slow retrieve. Because the standard tush hook has a heavier hook, I throw it on a bait caster. This is a 7-foot medium heavy power moderate action crankbait rod actually. So I'm throwing a crankbait rod, but it's a medium heavy power rod, and I'm pairing that again with 10-pound fluorocarbon line and using that slow retrieve. And this swim bait has been awesome for me. I've actually been throwing it through the fall here. I just got them recently, and then I've been throwing them every trip basically this last few weeks as we get into these colder months. And this swim bait is outperforming everything else I've been throwing, and this is basically my #1 swim bait right now. This is what I'm throwing when I go to the lake, and I really like it. I like throwing it on a bait caster too. It's really fun because I'm not always the biggest fan of spinning rods. But if you are going to throw a spinning rod, I have been throwing another bait, and actually I've been throwing this now for over a year. It's been like almost a year and a half with testing and stuff. And this is the Big Bite Baits Pro Swimmer in the 3.3 inch, and there's also a 2.8 inch. And that's with that Core Tackle finesse tush, the 2/0 1/4 ounce finesse tush. Now the reason I'm throwing this Big Bite Baits Pro Swimmer compared to a regular Kitech swim bait is that the Kitech is made from really soft plastic. And that soft plastic is great. It actually gives it a great motion when you're reeling that bait in at slow speeds, but it has a lot of tail kick at slow speeds, but not a lot of body movement. The thing about this Big Bite Baits Pro Swimmer is it's actually made from a slightly harder plastic, and that makes it easier to rig that 2/0 1/4 ounce tush in there, as long as you rig it very slow and methodically. Don't just try to like jam that hook into the bait, it'll split the nose otherwise. But if you're very slow, slowly work the bait up that lead on the hook shank, it will get on there. And I've caught so many big fish on this bait already. I had one trip last winter where I had like 23 pounds from my best 5 largemouth on a local lake, just swimming this thing super slow on the bottom. And again, it has more body roll to it with that internally weighted tush hook, and this bait will hold up. I caught all of those fish on one of these baits. Because they're a little bit more stout, they actually hold up to the abuse better, so you don't go through as many packs. And even though it's a knockoff, which I'm not usually the biggest fan of, I like this bait because of the harder plastic that it comes with. And it's not like so hard where the tail doesn't move. I mean, the tail moves fine, but it just holds up a little bit better with that tush hook, so that's why I throw it. And for my spinning gear, again, throwing this on 6-pound fluorocarbon line and 10-pound braided line from a main line. And this is actually a walleye rod from Denali in the Myriad lineup. It's a 7-foot medium power, moderate action spinning rod. Ooh, I got my light caught here. Give me a second. There we go. Got my bait back here. But again, this is a moderate action rod. So it bends further down the rod, and it allows those fish to get that bait in their mouth a little bit more on that swim bait. A lot of times those fish will kind of nip at the swim bait and then kind of eat the tail, then eat the whole thing. And if you set the hook too soon, you'll pull the hook right away from them. So a moderate action spinning rod is what you want. I also like a 7-foot rod because I'm making long casts bombing it out there. And I like that 1/4 ounce size in the winter because it allows you to keep that bait at depth without it digging into the bottom too much. Most of the time I'm throwing my swim baits in 15 to 30 feet of water in the winter time, and sometimes I'll get it as deep as 35 to 40 feet, and that 1/4 ounce will still get the job done at a super slow retrieve. But if I am fishing in 10 foot of water or less, I sometimes will go to a 3/16 ounce finesse tush or the 3/16 ounce regular tush. So either way, that's kind of the setup I use to keep that bait down there deep. It's a combination of that very slow retrieve in addition to the right equipment in terms of line, baits, and things like that, that'll allow you to fish that bait very slowly on the bottom and still get action to get those fish to bite. The third rule of wintertime swim bait fishing is fish your bait uphill. What do I mean by this? Well, basically what you want to do when you're fishing a finesse swim bait in the wintertime is make sure your bait is coming from deeper water to shallower water. The reason for this is because bass have a natural ambush instinct to try to ambush their prey in shallower water or against some type of hard edge, whether that's the surface of the water or the bottom of the lake. And so if you're working your bait, let's say there's a slope here and you're working it from shallower water out to deeper water, those bass are going to have a harder time ambushing your swim bait because there's more water here for them to actually have to chase the bait in. It's easier for the swim bait to escape. And this isn't as big of an issue in the summertime because the bass are so aggressive and they're going to chase for a long time. But in the winter, the fish are a lot more lethargic. They're not going to be as willing to chase. So you have to present your bait and make it look as vulnerable and easy to catch as possible. This is why when you're presenting your bait on that slope, instead of working your bait from shallow to deep, positioning your boat in deep water, casting into shallow, you want to position your boat in the shallower water area, casting into the deep water and working it uphill or up the slope into shallower water. Those bass then are going to be trying to pin that bait in that zone where there's less water in the water column, maybe up against a point, a road bed, a hump, anything like that. And the boat positioning really depends on the type of structure you're fishing. So for example, if you're fishing down like a deeper bluff wall, what you need to do in that case is instead of, let's say the bluff wall is right here, instead of trying to cast parallel to that bluff wall, what you might want to do is position your boat right against the bluff wall, cast out into deeper water, and then reel that bait at a 45-degree angle into your bluff wall. If you're fishing on a hump where you have a hump in the middle, you obviously want to position your boat more on top of the actual hump. So put your boat on the hump, casting out into deeper water, working it back up the hump. If you're on a ledge, work yourself so that your boat is on top of the drop-off, and then your boat's up here, casting over the ledge into your creek channel, into your deeper water, and then work that bait up to the ledge. That's kind of the idea. You want to try to work that bait into shallower water from deeper water, even if those fish aren't setting in deep water. A lot of times they'll be setting up on the edge of a point or a hump, and they might be 20 feet deep on the bottom, but there's going to be a side that's deeper on one side of those fish and a side that's shallower, unless you're on a perfectly, flat area that's completely flat, which can happen. In that case, you just have to work the bait through the fish. But most of the time, there's going to be a deeper zone and a shallower zone around them. Put your boat shallower, cast deeper, work your bait to the shallower area. That's going to give those fish the least work to try to actually commit to your bait. And as long as you're working it slow enough to keep it within their strike zone, you're going to be able to get a lot of bites with your swim baits. If you have forward-facing sonar, it's going to be a lot easier to make sure that your bait is in that strike zone, because you can just watch the bait on forward-facing sonar, adjusting your retrieve speed to keep that bait at the depth that you want it. But if you're not using forward-facing sonar, again, rule of thumb is to work that bait so that it's bouncing and hitting the bottom every 5 to 10 seconds. Sometimes if you go 5 to 10 seconds and you haven't hit the bottom, you may need to engage your reel, let some line out, let that bait sink all the way down to the bottom, then continue your retrieve. Maybe giving it 2-3 retrieve turns of the handle, then slowly bringing that thing back in as slow as you possibly can. Making sure you sometimes hit bottom, sometimes just stop the bait, let it pendulum, hit the bottom, and keep reeling. Fish it super slow. Keep that bottom contact, use the baits and stuff we talked about, make sure you're working that bait uphill, and you're gonna have a lot more success with swim baits this winter. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and learned something. If you did, make sure you subscribe to the Bass Fishing Declassified YouTube channel for more videos like this. If you want to listen to the audio from any of these videos, you can download the Fish Moment podcast as well to listen to these videos in podcast form on your way to the lake or while you're at work. Definitely check out the Fish Moment podcast as well. We'll see you guys in the next video.